dare I say, Monday episode of the Dobbin Bandits. Yes, every other week we're going to do 3 episodes a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, because we have so many episodes in the can. Because so many wonderful people want to speak to us, and this is the first one, and what a great one it is. We're talking to Gary Carlson. Gary is the man behind Big Bang Comics, and why is that so important? Because Big Bang Comics, in my opinion, is putting the fun back in comics. It's that old school comic feel that we grew up reading. Wonderful artists, wonderful writers from all over the country and all over the world working on these books. Gary was also influential on so many careers. He worked on Megaton, which brought in Rob Liefeld, Erik Larsen. He worked with Image. He worked with Marvel. But Big Bang is his pride and joy. He's going to talk about that, how it all came together, the future of Big Bang Comics, and more. Here's Gary Carlson. Mr. Gary Carlson. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, you bet. Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the very beginning. How did you first discover comics?
I was either 5 or 6 years old. My brother Jeff was 3 years older than me, and he and his friends were reading comics, and I was just hanging around and started reading them too. And we used to ride our bike. God, it was 7 or 8 blocks up to a grocery store to look at them and buy them. And he and his friends were trading comics, and some of them had older comics. So I was trading with those guys and ended up with a lot of older. This was 1962, 63. So I picked up a certain number of DC comics from the 50s. I mean, that's basically what they were reading. That's basically what was out there, I think, but that's what we were doing. So yeah, I just hung around, always bothering my brother, I'm sure. And and that's where I started reading them, and I fell in love. He moved on to different stuff. I mean, he moved up to Mad Magazine and other sort of stuff. But I mean, I was always happy with the comics.
So at what point in your life do you say to yourself, well, you know what, maybe comics is a career or something that I want to pursue for myself?
A couple of years after that, not too many, I saw a movie called How to Murder Your Wife.
Okay.
Jack Lemmon played a very successful syndicated cartoonist. He lived in a apartment in overlooking New York. He had money, and I thought, man, if that's what cartoonists live like, that's what I want to do. And from that moment on, I kind of aimed toward comics, comic books, comic strips, whatever. Yeah, I know.
We've heard that, so we can thank Jack Lemmon for.
Yeah.
So when you start doing your own books, what was the independent scene like at the time? Where was everyone sort of, working with each other to help each other out, or was everyone sort of doing their own thing?
I don't know about anyone else, but I was doing my own thing for the most part,
Right.
I mean, as far as I know, there were only a couple of books on the stand, a couple of one-shots. I mean, Warp Graphics, Richard Wendy Peeney's, that was out there, and people were putting out pretty much one-shots, and I don't have any of them here, and my brain's not what it used to be, but yeah, I'd see them at the comic shops and be one of these or two of those, not a whole bunch. And
right.
I suppose I was reading the buyer's guide back then, and there were probably ads. I mean, before that, people had been doing fanzines, but I mean, these things were good and professional enough to be in the stores, and I figured that's what I want to do, is be in stores.
Now, is the mentality a competition with DC and Marvel, or is the mentality an alternative to DC and Marvel?
Oh yeah, an alternative.
Right.
There was no way to compete with that. They were they were the big time.
So what did you want to bring to comic readers that maybe you weren't seeing in other titles?
Yeah, I don't know that I was trying to do anything really different than them. I was just trying to do my own stuff. I sent 1 or 2 things off, I think, to DC to see if I could possibly get some work. And it was like, nah. I thought, well, I wanted to do comics, and that was the way to do it, you know?
Mhm.
I was going to conventions, local conventions. By then I was in the Chicago suburbs, but there
Mhm.
were Comic Cons in Chicago, and I'd go there and see all kinds of artists, you know, and I was like, God, I like this guy's stuff. I like this guy's stuff. And they couldn't get work at Marvel or DC at that point. I mean, it must have been
Mhm.
a narrow thing, and they were using the people they had. And so, like I said, I came across guys like Mike Gustovich.
Mhm.
You know, he was one of the guys. I mean, his Cobalt Blue, I think, was out
Mhm.
at that point. And you know, I knew the book, and so I saw him, and I just loved his work and the other things he had done. I had picked him up here and there,
Mhm.
and just other guys I'd run into them, and they all said Marvel and DC aren't hiring right now. So it started with Mike Gustovich. I said, "Would you do a story for me if I paid you?" You know, I didn't pay much, but I was actually paying. So he said, "Yep." And that's where it started. Then I decided, well, I'll put out a book with all my different characters in it.
Mhm.
And that's pretty much what I did. I just contacted and checked with other artists, and I think I was paying $20 a page for pencils and 20 for inks and maybe 5 for letters. Maybe it wasn't quite that, but I mean that's basically what it was. It took forever to put together a 64-page book. I mean, not everybody cranked out the work, you know.
Right.
They were doing other stuff, some of their own projects, and you know, a lot of most of them were not professionals. So you'd work with guys that didn't have a professional attitude. You'd talk to them on the phone. They say, "Oh yeah, it's coming along great. I'm up to page 5," and blah, you know, and not at all. Or, well, I mailed it off, but it got lost in the mail, and it's like, oh, sure it did. So, um, yeah, that was pretty much how I was doing it. I just figured I'd do my own comics, and
Mhm.
uh, that's what I did.
So for you, could you talk about there are so many different characters. When you're creating a character, what's step one? Is it a name? Is it a look, an ability? Where do you begin to build a character?
They're all different. They're all different. I mean, a lot of them. I mean, sometimes the look's right there at first. Sometimes it changes and changes and changes.
Mhm.
I mean, same with the name, you know. I'd have to look back and see how long it took me to decide on Megaton.
Right.
I mean, he changed here and there. He had a mohawk at first, and he was white for a long time. And I finally thought, you know, a little bit of diversity, he'd look good as a black guy with the costume and stuff, and he did. So it was all different. I don't know that I've ever had a single plan, you know, as far as creating something.
Right. So with Megaton, how did that all come together? What was the basis for that, and what characters did you want to put inside the character?
Well, basically the ones I wanted to do are the ones in issue 1. I mean, there was Megaton, there was Ultraman and Ultra Girl.
Mhm.
Um, there was the Crusader
Mhm.
one. I mean, and he was a Batman type character.
Mhm.
Um, there was I don't know what all was in there. One of the stories wasn't mine, but it was fun. There was a character, I don't even remember now if he was the spook or the skull. It must have been the skull,
Mhm.
who was dressed up in bones, you know,
Yeah.
sneaking, you know. I mean, he was very, very a dark Batman type guy going, you know, through the shadows, and he'd come out at you, and you'd see a skull face or bones or whatever. He never went anywhere past the
Right.
first issue, but he was fun. There was basically the stories were all kind of a different genre. Um, and not totally, but I mean, there was some superhero stuff, a little bit of retro-y stuff, One of them was a character that was magic
Mhm.
on a different planet and stuff, but kind of science fantasy. So just I had Berserker was a science fictiony one, and so they were all. I just figured, well, no telling how many issues I'll get out. I'll put them all out in one issue anyway, and that's basically what I did. Yeah.
So what you're saying, I'm so curious right now because you mentioned all these characters. In your head, how far ahead did you have stories for each of them, or was it just sort of one issue at a time and kind of go from there? Because, like you said, you don't know how many issues you're going to be able to get out.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of them, like I said, never saw their second one. The Skull never saw a second story. Um, the science fantasy one didn't. The a second one was worked on, but I decided not to go in that direction. I mean, Dan Reed, who was drawing that, put together some stuff, and it was a little more science fiction-y than I wanted to go. I wanted science fantasy, and so we kind of parted ways there.
Mhm.
Megaton, I had just something of an idea. I mean, how he got his powers and what he might do.
Mhm.
The other ones, there were plans. I mean, Ultraman. I mean, in the first story, I mean, Ultraman. I mean, at the time, I mean, his powers blew up, and his daughter got them, and so that was a young character getting used to the powers, and I really didn't have any clues what she was going to do. Maybe some of his old villains and whatever. So yeah, no, it was just let's do it and let's go. I didn't have novels like plotted out for all of them. Nope.
So, how does one at the time get publicity for your books? How do you get your books out there? Are you going to cons? Are you going from shop to shop? How are you trying to create a buzz about the books?
It was basically ads in Comics Buyer's Guide
Mhm.
and I don't know, Comics Reader or some of those.
Mhm.
And that was it. I mean, and there were like 10, 12 distributors back then. So I'd put together an 8.5 by 11 sheet that I would send. Each distributor would get 500 to 1,000 of these
Mhm.
advertisement one-shot sheets,
Right.
and they would send them out to their customers, and that was how we went about it. That's how they figured,
Mhm.
um, okay, this is a book that's coming. This is it. It's got a cover by this guy and whatever. And
Right.
that was it. I mean, yeah, I was still doing conventions, but until the book came out,
Mhm.
when the book came out, then I was doing still the local conventions pretty much, but sitting there with a backdrop and copies of the books. And then that made it a little easier. People would stop off and show me their samples rather than in the early days. I walked around, Artist Alley and tried to find the guys whose work I thought was best and who were looking to do work. So that's how that went.
You speak of the artist, and we can go into that in a second. But what were some things you were looking for specifically in an artist to bring them onto the book?
A very professional style,
Mhm.
looking for people that had actually done some continuity.
Mhm.
A lot of guys, even now at shows and that, I mean, they're pinups and whatever, and then you try to get a story going out of them, and it's like they don't know what they're doing. So that's what I was hoping for. I mean, guys with a very, excuse me, a professional style, not real sketchy or whatever,
Mhm.
and that could tell a story. I mean, early on, I mean, when I first started, I was kind of laying out the stories, very crumbly. Big fan of the Legion and Jim Shooter, and I read that's how he did it when he was 14 or 15, and I started doing that until I realized some of the artists thought, "Ooh, this is kind of crummy."
Right.
So then I started typing them up and doing it a little bit more professionally.
What kind of relationship did you like to have with your artists? Because you hear some people who are just like, they give the artist a story, and that's really basically it until the art's done. And then some folks really like to be sort of in conjunction with them to work together. What kind of experience did you enjoy?
I considered just about all of them my friends. I mean, there were a lot of them. We'd talk on the phone pretty often. We'd talk back and forth. We'd send stuff in the mail.
Mhm.
Some of them stayed friends. Some of them weren't quite into that. I mean, at one point I had a writer that was doing some stuff, and he said, we're not friends. We're just working together, right? I was like, oh, okay, it's up to you. And since then, yeah, he's become a good friend.
Yeah.
But that's how it was. I mean, and some of the guys were local. I mean, Angel Medina lived 15 miles away from me, I think. So I'd go over and spend time at his folks' house. He was young. Down the basement, we'd sit and talk and share ideas and whatever, and talk on the phone. And Frank Fosco was in Chicago. That was a little farther away, but I'd drive into Chicago 45 minutes or so and sit and visit and talk and all that kind of stuff. The guys that were farther away, if they wanted to talk, we ended up talking a lot. I mean, I was working with my friends. I'm sure not all of them felt that way,
Mhm.
but that was it for me. So it still kind of works that way
Yeah.
with me.
You made a very good point a moment ago that it's something that we don't think of, but you can show up with a very nice pinup, but when it comes to doing panel after panel and all different stuff, how hard a lesson did you find that for artists to learn that this might be great, a stagnant picture, but to keep moving it along, how hard was that for a lot of guys?
Well, it wasn't too bad. I think a lot of the guys whose stuff I saw, I had seen
Mhm.
some of their work, and I mean, I knew that Mike Gustovich could write, tell a story, and Butch Geist could tell a story. I forget what I had seen, if it was the Crusaders or whichever one.
Mhm.
Um, but a lot of them I had seen some samples.
Mhm.
But actually, Butch Geist, I saw two or three illos that he had done for an ad for the Heroes Aren't Hard to Find convention, and I wrote to them, and they put me in touch with Butch, and then I saw some of the other stuff. But yeah, it was important to me that they tell a story. There was,
Mhm.
one or two that came along, and I was like, I didn't care for the storytelling and have the story redone. So
Right. It's
yeah,
kind of amazing now to look back at sort of the alumni of your book and where they've gone,
yeah,
since then. I mean, that has to make you very proud to say that you were one of the, foundation points for these guys' careers.
yeah, I do. I mean, like I said, I mean, it was for me, it was about me doing my comics and stuff. I was always proud to see the guys go on and
Right.
go on to Marvel and DC and wherever else. I mean, it wasn't too long before there were a lot of other companies and people were moving on there too. So, but I was happy for them, and I mean, they were off to more money basically,
Right.
and I knew it, and so many of them were like, "Oh, don't worry, if I start there, I'll keep doing stuff for you." I was like, "You're not going to want to give up 40 or 50 bucks a page
Right.
to do something for me." That's why some of them Butch Geist did a cover for number 7 later on, and Erik Larsen did a bunch of stuff over the years, and
Mhm.
Angel did covers for me later on the Berserker book, when he had already gone on. So, like I said, it was fun. They were nice guys, and yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that made doing Megaton so tough, is the guys were moving on. I mean, it went from a point where Marvel and DC weren't hiring anybody,
Mhm.
and then one issue, and Butch Geist was off to better pastures. I forget what all he was working on, but off to Marvel and whatever, and people were coming and going. I Mike Gustovich too. I mean, he was doing Justice Machine, and then he was Marvel and stuff. So he was gone after the first issue. So it was finding someone to pick it up, and sometimes they would suggest somebody, and some of those guys would come in and, okay, I'll do it. Oh, I'm off to Marvel, and then you find somebody else, and so very interesting. That's how that went. Yes.
I'm curious though, would Megaton's history been different if there was artist continuity, if there was one guy who you had that, you went through the whole run with it? Do you think that would change the trajectory of the book at all? Or do you think it
I
would?
think so. I think it would have made a big difference. And
Mhm,
yeah, I was stupid. And I mean, I had the guy Erik Larsen was there ready to go, but
mhm,
Vanguard wasn't exactly the title character, but he was a guy. I mean, he ended up leaving after 4 issues just to find more work. I mean, some of it was better paying, but I mean, there were 2 years between issue 1 and 2, and probably another year between 2 and 3, and
mhm,
he'd do his story and then have to kind of wait around or work in advance on the ones coming. Yeah, I've said a number of times, if I had been smart, I would have done a book
mhm,
with Erik Larsen drawing it and whatever. If you put it out every 2 months,
mhm.
you get into people's brains, and people know who you are, and that when you're doing uh, even now on the Big Bang stuff that I do, I mean, every issue is pretty much different character, sometimes different artists. And yeah, it's tough. People don't know what to expect. And they're like, oh, that's not the character I like, or oh, that's not the artist I like. And so it's tough. And yeah, it was tougher back then with sometimes waiting that long for another issue. And other guys came along, I mean, and the ones that came along and were able to put their issues out there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they got, they got locked in on the shelves. And I was kind of always, oh, here's another one. Every single ad I put out said now buy monthly, I think. And I
Mhm.
think it was only the last 2 or 3 issues that ever got even close to that. So
I want to talk some more about the different projects you worked on, but are there certain books or titles that you look at as sort of evolution points for yourself as a writer that you say, I started doing this, and then in this book I started changing it a bit, and that seemed to work, and ones that really stand out in your mind as changing points?
I I don't know. I don't think so. I've really, I mean, I did basically 8 issues of Megaton in the 80s, and then in the 90s we started Big Bang, and Big Bang was different because it was retro. It was trying to do 40s and 50s and 60s style comics.
Right.
So it was a different thing. I loved it. I was doing the Berserker book at Caliber Press,
Mhm,
and that was fun, but I was just doing it and cranking it out, and started working on the Vanguard books at Image. And again, I just kept doing my stuff. I mean, all along, even I spent, 24 issues or whatever on the Teenage Mutant Turtles, and tried to make it a Turtles book. Um, the point there was to do it not cartoony like the show, TV shows. And that kind of ticked a lot of people off the wrong way, because they're like, what is this? I mean, it was kind of going back to the original black and white
yeah.
Frank Millery stuff, and that turned off a number of people there. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I don't. Yeah, I don't feel like, oh, that there was a magical spot right here. I mean, I was just working continuously. I took a break in '87, and yet a lot of the stuff that started popping up again in '92. Some of the stuff had already been done, and
Mhm.
working on the new material. Was just happy to be working. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't. I'd have to have someone else tell me it felt different. Yeah, I mean, really, the big change. I mean, working on Megaton #1. I mean, 864 pages and whatever, 8 stories.
Mhm.
And by the second one, I was like, okay, the hand drawing layouts are throwing them off. So I'll, start writing a script, and a lot of times, I mean, some of them were scripts, some of them were just kind of Marvel style. This happens, then this happens, and then even that through some of the artists were like, this is pretty crummy. I better have somebody write this, and then come back and I'd be like, well, okay, that's not how it was supposed to go, but
Right.
there it is. So I'd say probably by the second issue, I was, and maybe even the end of the first one, I was a little bit more involved in putting it all down so the artists knew where I was coming from.
And I just also want to make note that with TMNT, you were sort of ahead of the curve because if you look at TMNT now, a lot of the stuff, it's a lot like what you were doing. It was back to that original style, sort of talking about, not the pizza and cowabunga all the time, but, and
Not all the time. Nope. Sometimes we'd throw it in for fun.
I want to talk image in a moment, but you did some work for DC and Marvel. When you do that, because you're so used to doing characters you created or characters that didn't have, a lengthy back history, when you get to do Aquaman, and that's sort of it's a franchise title. It's one of the sort of original ones. Is it strange playing with other people's toys and sort of having to be within maybe the parameters of the history of the character?
No, I mean, not so much like that. I mean, and part of that was, I was co-writing with Erik Larsen on that stuff. So on one hand, I was working with him, and on the other hand, I was kind of the link up to DC. So it was kind of making it work and making it flow.
Right.
And that got a little bit old. I mean,
Mhm.
the book, I mean, Aquaman especially was the book he was farthest ahead on. So the other three books or whatever he was writing
Mhm.
got a higher preference on him. And DC was forever coming after me saying, where's the dialogue? Where's the next plot? I was like, you guys hired Erik and Erik hired me. Why don't you check with him? So it got a little bit old. And
Mhm.
but the main thing, I mean, Erik and I always got along, still get along. I mean, and
Mhm.
I loved his work, and he must have liked mine enough to keep working with me over the years. So, I mean, just one note about Erik. I mean, people are like, "Oh, how did you meet him? How did you hire him?" I really didn't. I told you before, somebody was working on a story, and they didn't think they were pulling it off. And rather than drop out and tell me, they sent it off to Erik and asked if he'd do it for me. Now, I was familiar with his books, I mean, I had copies of his
Mhm.
that he had put out himself. So I just figured this guy is so good, he's going to be off to Marvel and DC tomorrow. So I didn't even bother trying, but this guy sent it off, and he's, oh, Erik Larsen's real interested in doing it. And I was like, well, that's good, but this character's not good enough for Erik Larsen. So we got to come up with something else. And so that's what I did. And
Mhm.
we started working on it and created it. And he enjoyed it. And I just kind of stood back and said, you're a better writer than me and a great artist. I like, do what you want. So we've always gotten along over the years, as far as I know. So
Yeah. In another life, could you have seen yourself being happy at a DC and Marvel with a long run on a book? Or do you think it would have gotten a little frustrating at times?
I think it would have been frustrating. I mean, even the little bit. I mean, like I said, I basically worked through Erik
Mhm.
because they were supposed to be Erik Larsen's books and ideas and whatever, and we'd kick ideas around and get the plot going and that. But it was supposed to be an Erik Larsen book. But even there, I mean, a lot of the editors and assistant editors, they all wanted to be writing comics, and it was, here's this idea. Why don't you put this in there? And that part of it got a little bit tough. Once we got past, I mean, I worked on them with Aquaman and with Nova, and once we got past that, I was like, I don't care.
Right.
That's a job. And I didn't know that I wanted a job. I was kind of doing what I wanted to do, and that was that was it. The other stuff was very much of a job, you know. I mean,
Right.
20 odd issues of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It was a job, but it wasn't bad. I mean, that went very easily. I worked, you know, I sent stuff to Erik for approval. I sent stuff to Peter Laird to
Mhm.
get approval on it, but pretty much they said, "Hey, do what you're doing," and I did. So that was fun. If I could have worked like that, I would have kept doing it. But it was a little bit different up at the big companies.
Which is there a book that was a I don't want to say it wasn't a job, but a more of a passion project? Was it Megaton, the one that I mean that it came naturally to you and it was just a passion to put it out there?
Megaton was, yeah, but by the time we got started with Big Bang Comics, that was too. I mean,
Mhm.
Chris Ecker and I came up with a concept. We were sitting at a real local convention in Elgin, Illinois, where we both lived, and he told me, he was sitting there, he said, I'm tired of art directors telling me I draw like an old guy. I said, he said, we're gonna do a story written like an old guy and drawn by me, an old guy. And we're not leaving here till it's done. So we sat at the table and kind of talked it over and plotted it out. I mean, we weren't quite done with it then. We left and went home, and it changed this way and that. But that, to me, that has always been the really fun adventure working on that, the Big Bang stuff, the retro. I mean, like I said, I grew up on old DC books, and I think Chris's original idea was, I mean, the Night Watchman was really the Crusader from Megaton #1, and he became something else, and then he became the Night Watchman. And I said, if we add a K to that, he's the Night Watchman, and that's a very Batman type thing, you know. And
Mhm.
his idea at first was a Daredevil character,
Right.
but yeah, I kind of switched it up on him, and I love it. I mean, I love doing the retro stuff. I mean, the stuff I loved doing, and reading, and I still love doing them and trying to hit the mark with them.
I think the reason there is such a loyal fan base for Big Bang is it is so refreshing to see that clean, original art that, sort of set the basis for comics. Do you think, the way comics sort of changed in the late 80s, early 90s, people just sort of got tired of gigantic people with machine guns that weigh more than a car, and they wanted to see what they grew up with, and that's why it caught on to so many people.
I think it worked then in the '90s because a lot of people had grown up on those comics.
Right.
It's a lot different now, 30 years later, and
Mhm.
the young artists grew up on the stuff in the '90s, and later. It's tougher to find people that understand
Right.
um, the '50s and '40s and '60s and even the '70s, you know. So,
Mm.
but the stuff we do. I mean, Pedro and Gasto does the stuff and tries to bring it into a little bit more modern area,
Mhm.
uh, and yeah, we try to keep kind of the histories of the characters. I mean, in kind of a silver age, kind of a bronze age, kind of a modern age type thing, without saying this has been going on for 60 years. It's kind of like, I kind of look at it at the moment as being almost like, okay, the silver age was kind of a 20-year thing, you know, and then the '70s and '80s was another, just a 10-year spot. So it's only been 30 years, and
Mhm.
people are still alive but older and whatever. So we don't specify it, but that's pretty much the way I play the game.
And the thing with the stories is that they're so well written and they're fun to read. Sometimes comics now, I believe, are kind of heavy-handed and there's a darkness to them.
Always,
It
yeah.
might work for the book, but too much of it just becomes a drudge to read through.
I
What's
agree.
what style do you try to bring? I mean, how do you keep your style so fresh and so entertaining with readers?
Yeah, myself, I think it's just it's just my style. I mean, if I'm writing something from the 40s, I try to simplify it and try to make it read like the ones uh, that I'm aiming for. Same with the 60s style stuff. And
Yep.
but it's basically all me. I mean, there's a certain amount of it in there. I try to tell a story in every issue and
Mhm.
try to have something going on, you know. I mean, sometimes it's just a villain and a fight and whatever, but a lot of times there's other stuff going on, and it, try to play it in with a fake history, even if I'm the only one that knows exactly where this story is taking place. So
Was there any hesitation or nervousness about bringing it to Image?
no, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. We started at Caliber, and when we very first started, they're like, nobody wants to see this old retro stuff. So we did the Berserker book and put it as backups in Berserker. And like 90% of the stuff we heard from people was how much they loved the backups in there. And we kept telling Caliber, and they're like, no, I don't think so. And then 1963 came out, and they're like, you know what? There is a market for this. So we'll give you a Big Bang book of your own. So we set it up at Caliber. The first one was going to be a 64-page Golden Age book with all the characters. The second one was going to be a Silver Age book, and the third one was going to be a modern style. Set up all the, all the different areas or time frames, whatever.
Mhm.
And right off the bat, that got screwed up because Caliber signed a deal with a distributor to go through Walmart, and the books had to be, I don't know what it was, 32 pages, I suppose. So
Mhm.
had to split the 64 pager basically into three books.
Mhm.
It was three books, but I mean, it was one, two, and then later on, number zero had the other stuff in there. And then number two was the Silver Age, and no, or number three was the Silver Age one, and four was the modern one. So, uh, but then the distributor came by and said, we like this stuff and we want to own the copyright on this. So, and what they wanted to do was break it in three. Chris Ecker and I would keep a third of it.
Mhm.
They would have a third of the copyrights, and Caliber would have a third of the copyrights.
Right.
And our thought was like, that leaves you guys in total control of what goes on with it. So we're not going to do that. So they said, well, we're not going to be carrying your book anymore. So I was like, all right. And I checked in with Erik. I mean, like I said, I was working on Vanguard at that point. He liked Big Bang. I mean, Erik grew up on old comics and
Right.
whatever, liked what we were doing and let us use Mighty Man. And he
Mhm.
said, well, come on over here and we'll put it out here. And it was like, okay. So yeah, there was no second thoughts. We were very happy to go to Image.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with Chris Ecker because you guys have really done some wonderful stuff together. How, is it a rare thing to find someone that you connect with so easily in the comic world?
I don't think so. Like I said, so many of the guys I've worked with, I consider
Mhm.
my good friends, and it's that way with him. I mean, he was the manager at the comic book shop that I went to
Mhm.
back in those days. I mean, I was going to college, and I would stop in at the comic shop,
Mhm.
and we got to talking, and he'd been in the fanzine and fandom
Mhm.
all along, which I hadn't. I mean, I was working almost full time and going to school full time, and but we started working on comic strips, and it was fun. I mean, I didn't have the time, so he was drawing them. He was an artist, and we did two or three or four over the years, and just loved it. I mean, I was only writing it, but I was, still a cartoonist and still part of the cartoons. And
Mhm.
we had the one was held by the Los Angeles Times Syndicate for a couple of months.
Mhm.
And they finally passed on it. They passed on a couple of them. I think they went with the Lone Ranger or something.
Mhm.
And I was like, and we were both down, I was like, we were that close. I mean, having they were holding on to it. They asked to see more of them, and
Mhm.
so we did up another batch of samples and whatever. And he's like, "All right, let's do some comic books," because that's when the independent comic scene kind of started. So
Mhm.
we just kind of shifted from there to the other one, and we've kept working on. Well, I mean, he worked on the first issue of Megaton,
Mhm.
and then he moved to Now Comics. He was doing, I guess it was Ram
Mhm.
at Now Comics until that kind of fell apart. And toward the end, he came back. Um, no, that was Eben the Raven at Now Comics. Sorry. And then he came back, and at the very end of the Megaton days, he did 2 issues of a book called Ram. And
Right.
before we folded, there were a couple of issues of um, Grass Greens, Wild Man, and Rubber Roy also.
Mhm.
So there were basically 8 issues of Megaton and 2 issues of Wild Man and 2 issues of Ram before we gave in.
Mhm.
But no, it was always fun to work with him. I mean, he lived in town. I mean, by the time I got married and moved across town, he
Mhm.
was 3 or 4 blocks away, so I'd see him. But I mean, we get along real well. Um, I love working with him. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he's of the Jack Kirby type where ideas flow out of him and very cool ideas. A lot of the Big Bang stuff, a lot of it, anything, has been done with help from him, and just a lot of fun. And we get along, and we don't fight, and it's amazing. Yeah.
If you look, if people Google you on the internet, a lot of folks say the Godfather of Image Comics.
Yeah.
I'm just curious your thoughts of the evolution of the company because it starts off as this almost like rock band Kiss, where you have all these mega stars and these big comics. There's comics coming out, and it kind of goes down a little bit, and it comes back. And where it is right now is sort of changing the comic industry. There's so many different titles, not just superheroes, but really
Oh,
putting
no,
out
no.
books for everyone. From your perspective and watching this evolution, what do you think about Image and where it started and where it's gone to?
Oh, I'm very proud to have been a part of it. I mean, when it started off, it was 6 or 7 guys,
Mhm.
and they kind of each had their own studio, and they each had their own books. And over the years, it's all kind of melted down into one company, and one guy probably running the whole thing. I mean, the main partners get to do what they want for the most part, but the other ones, it's more of a company now. I mean, back when I was there, the possibility was there to use other characters, but sometimes it was yes, sometimes it was no, depending on what you wanted to do and that. So, I mean, at one point we were looking to do something with Spawn, and that one kind of fell through,
Mhm.
and it just became a different character. And yeah, it's very different. I mean, it was fun. It was I mean, Erik and Rob were 2 guys that I knew, and the other guys I didn't really know them, but I
Mhm.
mean, Chris was friends with Jim Valentino.
Mhm.
So I mean, I met him through Chris and 1 or 2 other guys. So it was it was interesting. It was fun to see them all doing books kind of in their style.
Right.
Um, but yeah, now it's much more of a company. I mean, just going through previews. I mean, that's my connection with a lot of the comics these days. I go through previews, and it's like,
Mhm.
oh wow, wouldn't even know I was looking through the image section until I get to Dragon and you know that stuff. So
If go back in time and let's say DC and Marvel said to you, Gary, whatever character you want, you pick and you do as you please with it, what would you choose?
that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I mean, growing up, my favorites were the Teen Titans,
Mhm.
the original Teen Titans, and then the new Teen Titans,
Right.
and the Legion of Superheroes. And I would guess that would have been on the top of my list, but it would have been fun to do Batman.
Mhm.
Um, would have been very fun, to do a Superman story. But I mean, those are probably would have been the top of my list. So
That makes sense to me. And I mean, do you ever sit back and think about the importance of what you did and what you've done has had on the comic community and to fans as well?
no, I don't. I mean, I have a guy been doing it for 40 years and it never really been much of a success. I mean, the 70s at the beginning, there were so few comics that people kind of know who we were and who I was.
Mhm.
And then, we went out in the black and white explosion, and I came back when they were starting Image because um, a lot of them, because Rob's first book was going to be Youngblood, which had been scheduled to come out through Megaton. That was really the reason I gave up when we
Mhm.
solicited that as the Megaton special #1, and the orders there were a couple of hundred copies ordered, and this was a cover, I mean, by Rob and ink by, I guess, Jerry Ordway. And
Mhm.
it was just, I figured it was as close to looking mainstream as possible. And nobody knew, nobody cared. And I was like, okay, if we can't sell this and all the other books are selling those kind of numbers, it's like there's just no sense in doing it. So, but, but, when they were starting Image, I mean, Rob was at a show in Chicago, and I just stopped by to say hi. And he's like, huh. He's like, have you got any copies of the Megaton Explosion? That was a Who's Who book, and the double spread in the middle was Youngblood. And I was like, well, sure, I've got some at home. And so he asked if he could have them, and I sent them off to him so he could use them to promote it. And then people were talking about me, and that's probably when the godfather of Image Comics, and that eventually morphed into people were calling it the grandfather of Image Comics, which they both, it's okay by me, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's don't even know where I was going with it, but that's yeah, as far as me, I don't think of myself. I mean, my next door neighbor saw the uh, thing, a write up on me on online, the Wikipedia or
Yeah.
something. And it's like, oh, you're famous. I mean, like, well, okay, it's like I'm sort of almost famous. Some people know who I am, and that's pretty much how I consider it. I look at it and think, no, I've never quite hit, farther up than part of the way, and the last bunch of years I've just been doing what I wanted and figured out the heck with it and
Right.
doing it. I'm gonna have fun, and I have.
That's awesome. And as far as artist evolution goes, when you look at the young blood that was in your book, and then you look at what came out with Image, uh, very different artistic style and stuff like that. If he had put out the exact same art and the exact same characters that ran in your book in Image #1, do you think it would have been as big a hit?
It was a little bit different
Mhm.
from where his style had evolved to,
Right.
and I don't know. He was so famous at the time. Geez, he was doing commercials for,
Levi's jeans.
yes, Levi's. I think they would have still sold a big number of them. I mean, but it didn't have the hallmark, yeah, the big guns and
Right.
and all that stuff. So I don't know how it would have gone, but
Yeah.
like I said, it was fun stuff. I mean, it was very Legion of Superhero-ish or whatever, which is what had appealed to me. So,
So, what can fans expect? What new projects do you have coming out? What can fans be looking forward to in the future?
well, it's all Big Bang stuff right now. I mean, we're just putting issues out. I mean, it's weird because I mean, I'll send it off to Kablam and get copies back in 2 or 3 weeks, but then it'll take 2 or 3 months before they get listed on Indie Planet. So, I mean, I think now they just put number 26 up. I mean, and 27 is sitting there.
Mhm.
I just sent Dr. Weird #1, Volume 3 #1 off to Kablam and have, I'll probably get those back in a couple of weeks. I mean, that was written by Pedro
Mhm.
and and it's pretty great. I mean, Dr. Weird's a cool character. He goes back to like 1961 or so.
Mhm.
Howard Keltner created him for Star Studded for the fanzines, and he kind of went on over the years. And then in 1970,
Mhm.
kind of reinvented by George R. Martin and Jim Starlin for two issues of the book there. So,
Mhm.
uh, so anyway, we're doing it. It's an updated version
Right.
of the origin. Goes a little deeper into where some of the stuff comes from, but it's
Mhm.
fun. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous artwork in there, and that's one of the next ones coming up. There after that, there's going to be an issue, a Thunder Girl issue. It's going to be a 40 pager, very 1960s
Mhm.
issue, super girlish. I mean, the art's not quite Jim Mooney or anything, but the story's absolutely perfect.
Mhm.
And that's Gianluca Ceratelli worked on that. And there's just a couple other things that are in line. Actually, there's going to be an issue with the Pantheon of Heroes, which is my version of the Legion.
Yeah.
And it's very fun to see that and very fun to be working on that. So
That's.
those are the ones that are coming. Chris Ecker and Ben Torres are still working on the Night Watchman Creatures of the Night
Mhm.
series, which is out there. The first two issues are out, third one's coming along, and
Mhm.
I guess the fourth one's coming too. So those are fun. And Sterling Clark has done three issues of the National Guardians, which is a very Marvel-ish, Avengers-ish series. And again, I mean, I kind of co-write, co-plot, and co-write those things, so it moves in the direction I want it to,
Mhm.
and they're just very fun, and they're very fun to see, So that's there'll probably be another issue or two of that. So that's there's stuff coming.
It's it's pretty awesome. You guys are creating this universe, of your own, and
Yeah.
it's reviving characters that maybe have gotten lost in time and bringing them back. I think it's such a wonderful thing because somebody took the time to create these characters, and it was their passion, and you're bringing it back, with new art and new writers and putting it back in the forefront. I think that's just so wonderful.
Well, that's it, and that's how it was with Dr. Weird. I mean, at the end of the Megaton days, I mean, I worked with Grass Green. He was probably out of hand in all 8 issues
Mhm.
of Megaton, and then the 2 issues of Wild Man, and he was real good buddies with George R. R. Martin.
Mhm.
No, not George R. R. Martin. Howard Keltner. I'm sorry, George. But and so yeah, he kind of put me in touch with Howard, and we did a Dr. Weird story or two, and he liked what we were doing and whatever, and he was very sick at the time and asked if we wanted my partner on that, Ed DeGeorge, I mean, asked if we wanted to buy the character and keep it going for him, and that's what we've done. And we've pretty much done it, over the years. I mean, the 90s, there were a couple of issues. I
Mhm.
mean, there was the one reprinting the Starlin George R. R. Martin stuff. And then we did 2 issues at Caliber. And after we had left there, Ed did 2 issues for October Comics. And since then, he's been a part of the Big Bang, showing up here and there. And um, just a lot of fun. Yeah, that's one of the few characters that really pre-existed Big Bang, and it's fun
Mhm.
to be part of and be able to be doing it.
And we're back. What a nice guy Gary is. So much to talk to him about, but Big Bang, like I said, it's putting the fun back in comics. These are great books. So many different folks writing for it. Our guest later this week will announce then, but he is writing for it as well. A wonderful young man. So Gary, thank you for all you're doing for comics. We'd love to have you back on. And if you have the time today or this week, go to cbcawards.org. The first two categories we are nominated for. We are so honored. Please vote for the Dobbin Bandits. To get an award like this, Uh, that would be pretty awesome. It would be crazy to think that we've come this far in our careers. So if you could do that for us, we'd really appreciate that. Have a wonderful Labor Day. 2 more episodes this week. All right. So get yourselves ready. They're really good ones as well. And we'll talk to you soon.